Welcome to the tutorial on network clustering, a problem that is over 50 years old and still going. I am Daniel Figueiredo from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro.
And I'm Maximilien Dreveton from EPFL in Lausanne, Switzerland. And we're going to talk about information theoretic criteria and efficient algorithm for graph clustering.
The organization of this tutorial is divided into 4 parts. In the first part, we'll do an introduction to network clustering. We'll see what is network clustering and why it's important to cluster networks. In the second part, we'll see how to detect network clusters by looking at different algorithmic approaches that can reveal clusters.
And in the third part, we'll try to answer the following question: when can network cluster be identified? And the motivation is, as you can see, these 2 networks. On the left, we can see relatively easy 2 different clusters, but by simply adding an edge on the right, then the problem becomes impossible. And finally, on the last section, we'll cover everything that was not covered in the tutorial. So we'll mention a few relevant topics that, because of time, we did not have time to cover.
Okay, so let's get started. The first question that we have to address is, what is network clustering? So network clustering is just to find a partition in the set of nodes of the network. Every node must be exclusively in one part. It's the same definition as the partition of a set in mathematics. Network clustering has different names coming from different fields that study this problem over the last decades. It's known as graph partitioning, graph clustering, network community detection. These all refer to the same thing, and a cluster is often referred to as a subgraph, a part, a cluster, or a community. So let's take a look at this network and let's try to cluster it. So in the figure of the middle, we have a clustering of the network with 2 parts. Nodes 3 and 6 are in one part, and nodes 1, 2, 4, and 5 are in a different part. And the figure on the right, we have a clustering with 3 clusters, where nodes 1, 4 is in one cluster, 2, 5 in the second, and 3, 6 in the third. So at this point, you can see that there are many different ways that we can cluster this little network. And the question would be, what does it make for a good partition? What is a good way to cluster this network? In order to answer that question, we must quantify the quality of a partition. And that's actually the essence of network clustering, is defining how good is my cluster. To partition a network, to define any arbitrary cluster, is quite easy. To find a good partition or an optimal partition under some criteria can be quite hard and quite challenging, making the problem interesting. So why should you cluster a network? There's at least 2 reasons for doing that. The first is that it's a fun and hard combinatorial problem to determine the optimal clustering of a network. For example, to find a partition that minimizes the cut size, something that we're going to talk about here, it's an easy problem and can be solved in polynomial time. To find the balanced partition, where the cluster sizes have the same size, that minimizes the same metric, the cut size, is a difficult problem. It's considered an NP-hard problem. It has been shown to be an NP-hard problem. So there are many problem variations and many theoretical results under the problem of finding the optimal cluster for a particular graph. The second reason that we would like to do clustering of a network is that the clusters can reveal some latent information about the nodes. Real network structure is not random. The network's structure can reveal some information that is not present in the network itself, in the nodes itself, but it can be shown, it can be revealed through the clustering assignment. When you review clusters, when you find clusters, you actually reveal some information about those nodes and about the network. And there are many applications for this, because networks are everywhere. You can find networks in any kind of domain, and understanding information of these networks is an important problem. Network clustering has become a fundamental tool in the data science toolbox precisely because it can reveal information latent information about the nodes of the network. So let's talk about one kind of network. This is social networks. And in a social network, the nodes represent individuals, and the edges encode some pairwise relationship among these individuals. It can be friendships in Facebook, contacts in WhatsApp, physical proximity, co-authorship in works, and etc. And there's a growing number of real data sets concerning all sorts of relationships, which makes it interesting to analyze these networks. This gives rise to social network analysis, which is an area that focuses on analyzing social networks to reveal information about the individuals and about the network itself. You can reveal the social structure of people, identify social behavior and influential individuals, quantify the importance of relationships, and much more. And social network analysis is much older than you think. The first volume of the journal, the academic journal called Social Networks by Elsevier, was published in 1978. Of course, network clustering is also part of social network analysis because by clustering the network, we can reveal, for example, the social structure of those individuals or identify influential groups. One example are criminal networks, where the clusters can reveal individuals that work for the same criminal organization or that are plotting some kind of attack or some kind of misdemeanor. So here's a real network, a real social network, which is the interaction between terrorists involved in the September 11th attack in the United States. So each node here is a person, and edges encode interactions between them, and the different colors represent the people, the terrorists that were inside each of the hijacked plane during this attack. And you can see that the colors can reveal a close group of individuals forming a cluster in this network. For example, the red correspond to the people that were inside one of the plane, and the green, for example, another set of people inside another plane. And you can see that these clusters are very well formed in this network. Another example is biological networks, where nodes represent some biological entity, for example, a species, a protein, a gene, or a neuron, and the edges encode some pairwise relationship among these nodes. For example, the predator-prey in the species, protein interactions between proteins in a particular cell, gene expression, or synapses between neurons in a neuron network. And there are also a growing number of real data sets concerning all sorts of relationships in biological networks. Clustering in biological networks is very important because, again, these clusters can reveal some information about the network. For example, clusters of species can reveal their role and their importance in an ecosystem. Clusters of genes or proteins in the protein interaction network can reveal their functional role in that biological system. In particular, clustering of the PPI, the protein-protein interaction network, started to be done in the year 2000, in particular in bioinformatics, and revolutionized how we understand interactions and proteins inside the cell. An example is that cluster in the PPI network can be used to define more effective drugs, and that's actually being done today. Again, clusters in the species networks can be used to refine the map of evolution of species across time. These are just two examples of why clustering is important in this kind of networks. Here's an actual PPI network. Every node here is a protein, and the edge represents the fact that two proteins can interact and can couple with each other. These proteins are found in this bacteria, and you can see that when you cluster this network, you reveal 6 different clusters of proteins, and these different clusters represent their functional role inside this organism. So there are other kinds of networks, for example, information networks, where nodes represent some information, like a word, a document, a research paper, or a website, or whatever, and edges encode some pairwise relationship between these documents. For example, similar meaning, related topic, cited by, hyperlink to, and etc. One very important kind of information network is the knowledge graph. In this graph, we synthesize all sorts of information and relationship in a single network. Another kind of network is infrastructure networks, where nodes represent some artifact of an infrastructure, for example, train stations, airports, power plants, data centers, and the edges encode some connectivity between these parts. For example, train line between train stations, airplane flights between airports, transmission lines between power plants, and optic cables connecting data centers. And clustering in these networks, again, can reveal information about these systems. For example, clusters can reveal properties of the networks, and these can be used to tackle different problems. To be more precise, clustering in the knowledge graph can reveal related topics to a user search. For example, Google keeps and maintains a very, very large knowledge graph, and it's used to provide answers. When you type a query into the Google search, the knowledge graph is used to provide better results for your search. Clustering is also used in the so-called user item graph, which is a relationship between people and items they have purchased or they have looked at, and these are used in recommendation systems to provide recommendation. The bottom line is that there are way too many networks and way too many applications for us to cover in this tutorial, and in this tutorial the goal is to give a broad overview of network clustering without going into much detail of how specific networks can be clustered. Good. So here's a good, what to make for a good partition and how to find them. So here's an intuitive definition of a good partition, a good network cluster. Most edges should be within the cluster and few edges should be between different clusters. Moreover, clusters should have relatively similar sizes. So here's a formal definition to be made precise later. So consider a cost function for a given partition P of a graph C of P. So C of P measures the cost or the quality of a particular partition on the graph P, and it can encode local or global information concerning the cluster, the partition, and the graph itself. Using this cost function, we can define a template to all network clustering algorithms. The first step is you choose your favorite cost function C of P. And then you run an algorithm to solve the following combinatorial problem, find P star, which minimizes the cost function C of P over all possible partitions P. This algorithm that's going to find the optimal P star is often a heuristic or an approximation due to the runtime complexity. So it does not necessarily return P star, it will return an approximation or a heuristics to P star. And the problem here is that the number of possible partitions that our algorithm would have to test is 2 to the power n. It grows exponentially with the number of nodes in a network. So if you have a network of 100 nodes, this becomes prohibitively expensive to enumerate all possible partitions. Therefore, we need some kind of efficient and smart algorithm to try to understand P star, to try to reveal P star. So, some fundamental issues with this template. The first is that there's no silver bullet to network clustering. And by that, I mean that there's no single best cost function C of P and no single best algorithm. Different cost functions and even different algorithms for the same cost function can find very different clusters. And what clusters should reveal the latent information that we're after is application dependent. In particular, think about identifying clusters of influential groups in a social network or clusters of proteins that have the same functional behavior in the PPI. These two domains are very different, and tailored cost functions and algorithms for each domain is often more effective giving rise to many different cost functions and many different algorithms. The good news is that network clustering algorithms can be clustered. Most cost functions have a common feature, they are very similar to one another, and most algorithms leverage some common approach in the literature. And the good news is that there are relatively few approaches to designing network clustering algorithms. There's the cut-based approach, modularity-based, Bayesian inference, label propagation, and learning-based algorithms. And we'll see these approaches here in the tutorial in part 2. Good. Here is a network clustering timeline with a few selected papers published over the last 50 years related to network clustering. So the first paper in our timeline is Kernighan and Lin, published in 1970, which proposes an algorithm to approximate the graph bisection problem. In 1973 and 1975, we have a couple of papers by Donoff and Hoffman and Fiedler proposing spectral graph clustering. In 1983, we have the definition, the proposal of the stochastic block model, something that we'll discuss here in part 3. We have a 1989 paper, Johnson et al., proposing finding clusters using simulated annealing, using MCMC methods. And then we jump to 2005, where modularity was first proposed by Newman and Girvan. 2008, we have the proposal of the Louvain algorithm, which solves for maximum modularity. And then in 2014, we have a couple of papers on the theoretical side establishing the exact recovery threshold for the stochastic block model. 2 papers published in the same year, one by Maximilien and the other by Mossoel and his co-authors. 2 things to note here is that this timeline is definitely not representative of the thousands of algorithms and thousands of papers that have been published in the last 50 years on network clustering. And the second thing to note is the timeline is not drawn to scale. So as you can see, network clustering is over 50 years old, and the interest in network clustering has exploded in the last 15 years. And one of the reasons for that is that we have more and larger real networks about pretty much everything, and there are many applications that are trying to reveal information from these networks that have become important in the last 15 years. So before we start, let's define some notation. We're going to consider G to be an arbitrary graph with V denoting the node set and E the edge set. We're going to assume the graph is undirected and unweighted unless otherwise stated. Little n is the number of nodes of the graph and little m is the number of edges in the graph. A is going to be the adjacency matrix of the graph G, so Aij equals 1 if and only if Ij is an edge of the graph. We also consider P to be a partition defined by C1, C2 up to Ck. So it's a partition in the sense that a node is present exactly in one of these sets and every node must be in one of the sets. K here is the number of clusters or the number of communities of this partition. One very important notation is the vector Z, which is called the cluster assignment vector. Zi equals L. This means that node I belongs to cluster L, and L is a number between 1 and K. So every node of the network is assigned to a particular cluster in this vector. So let's go back to our function C of P, the function that measures the quality of a partition. The most basic function that's been studied over 50 years is the cut size. The cut size basically measures the number of edges with an endpoint in C1 and another endpoint in C2, assuming here that we only have 2 partitions. So C of C1 and C2 is the sum for every node of the indicator function ZU different than ZV. Okay, so for every edge UV, I check its endpoints. If the endpoints are in different communities, if ZU is different than ZV, then I count this as a 1. So this is the most elementary cost function to assess the quality of a partition, as I said. So one problem with the cut size is that it does not consider the number of nodes in the cluster. Because of that, when you optimize for the cut size, you find very unbalanced clusters. Almost all nodes are in a cluster and few nodes are in the other clusters. To avoid that, we can normalize the cut size by the number of possible edges in the cut, giving rise to another metric called the cut ratio. So the cut ratio is just the cut size divided by the number of possible edges that I can have in my cut, which is given by the size of C1 times the size of C2. So the third variation is to define a priori the sizes of my clusters. So I determine the cluster size, and if I want equally sized clusters, I can divide n by k. So that will give every cluster the same size, plus or minus 1, because we have integer number of nodes. And then we only consider partitions within this constraint. So I can now compute the cut size between two partitions, C1 and C2, but I only consider partitions that respect the sizes that I established a priori to my clusters. When the cluster sizes are equally, this problem is known as the balanced partition problem or the planted partition problem, because the cluster sizes have identical sizes. So another way to measure the quality of a partition is to assume knowledge of the latent information of a given network. Suppose that we have this latent information, and if we have that, we can use this information to induce a network partition C1, C2, Ck, where Z, my cluster assignment vector, basically represents the latent information. Z is going to be assumed to be known and is going to be assumed to be the desired partition, the ground truth. So what my algorithm should do is try to find this particular partition given by this ground truth. So here's an example of a network of colleges, universities in the United States, and games of football played between universities. So every edge represents a match between two teams, and every node represents a school, a university. And the different clusters, the different colors here, represent the different leagues that these universities belong to. And you can see that teams play within their league and with teams outside the league. So lots of edges inside the league and edges outside the league. So we can use this information as the ground truth. For example, the information of which league a team is in is the ground truth. And my algorithm would then try to reveal this information using just the network structure. So that's a different way to assess the quality of a partition. Okay, so how can we measure the quality of a partition using the ground truth? So let's assume Z is the ground truth, and I run a network clustering algorithm which returns a partition C1 hat, C2 hat, up to Ck hat, with cluster assignment Z hat. Now we can measure the quality of this partition, Z hat, with respect to the ground truth Z. So one metric to do this is called the accuracy, and let's take a look at the case of two clusters. The accuracy is just the fraction of nodes whose cluster agree with the ground truth. So I sum for every node of the network, and I look at the assignment of node U in Z hat and in Z. If they are the same, I count myself as correct, and I divide by n in the end to get the fraction of nodes that I got correct. A problem here is that the algorithm can never identify the label of the cluster. What will be the accuracy if C1 equals C2 hat and C2 equals C1 hat? So my algorithm got everything correct except the label 1 and 2. And of course, there's no information for the algorithm to guess the right label for each cluster. So in this case, the accuracy should be maximum. We got everything correct except the labels. So in order to tackle this problem, we can consider the largest accuracy across all permutation of cluster labels. So a problem here is that the number of permutations of the cluster labels grows as k factorial, because k is the number of clusters. And each permutation requires time O of n to compute the accuracy. So this strategy, when k grows, is not very practical to define the quality of the partition. So To assess the quality of a partition, we can use other problems, other techniques, and this problem is a fundamental problem in data clustering. It's not only a problem with network clustering. We have the ground truth assignment, and we have what an algorithm returns, and we need to assess the quality of this guessed partition. Accuracy is just one approach, and it's not necessarily the most adequate. Various metrics have been proposed in the literature. For example, the normalized mutual information between the partition and the ground truth. The RAND index is a metric that counts pairs of elements in the same and in different clusters. The adjusted RAND index, which adjusts the RAND index to remove the influence of random clustering events. The confusion matrix, which looks at the fraction of elements correct for each pair of clusters. And there are even other metrics in the literature. So what's important here is that there's no clear preference, as the comparison between alternative partitions can depend on the metric. So if you look at a particular metric, one metric can say that a partition is better than the other. If you change a metric, the result can be different. So the quality of the partition actually depends on the metric that you're using to assess. So again, there's no silver bullet here when looking for a metric to assess the quality of a partition. One important thing is that the ground truth of a partition can be used to compare clustering algorithms. And then one question is how to obtain networks with ground truth information about its clusters. And the solution here is to use network models. To use mathematical models that can randomly generate networks with clusters according to a ground truth. And then when I have a network for ground truth, I can use this network to assess the quality of a clustering algorithm. I run my algorithm on this network, the algorithm returns a cluster assignment vector, and I can then assess the quality using the ground truth information. And this is something that we will discuss in part 2 and part 3 of the tutorial. Good, so let's stop here. This is the end of part 1.